like that just means that I'm working in the off season when a lot of coaches only work for 6 to 9 months of the year, depending on how far they go internationally.
This is Zento from Esports Heaven, and I have here with me Croissant, victorious, and it was kind of a crazy game. Why don't you walk me through, I guess, the draft, because they drafted Darius into you guys.
Yeah.
Were you kind of like expecting that at all? Did this pop up before?
Yeah, so definitely I was expecting him to pick Darius, and was just deciding between the Aatrox and the Darius ban. We'd never seen him play it, but just kind of with the structure of their 1-2-3 draft and then their willingness to like have 3 picks that they wanted against Croissant, I was pretty sure he was going to go for it, but was confident that he wouldn't be very impressive on the champion, so we just let him have it.
So Contracts got Ivern this game. How is it fitting Ivern into a draft? Because that's a very niche pick. Yeah. So I imagine from a strategic perspective, it's I guess different, or weird to fit into a draft. How do you interpret Ivern, I guess?
Yeah, I think Ivern is a champion that even after being in pro play for actually a good amount of, not like a super meta champion, but at some point was like higher presence than you expect from any of like the weirder champions that come from solo queue. People still don't really understand his role, and so a lot of times you if you're going Ivern, then you have an enchanter in your team, so now you just want to build around that and have more bodies. And when we have Croissant, when we can get Rel, it just gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how and there's a lot of different mid champions you can play with it, right? You can play Azir. You can also play more of the melees like Yone and stuff that utilize Ivern's shielding and like added enchanter utility. But it's just one of those champions that we're always able to play, and that is actually more flexible than I think people realize. Yeah.
So I want to talk about your position on NRG. You're now the strategic director, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So how is that different from your role previously a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm doing pretty much, you could say like 80 to 90% of my previous responsibilities, but kind of something that wasn't in my title, but things that I still wanted to do is like, I was always very invested in the development of the other coaches on that on CLG throughout 2022 and 2023, but it's not usually under like the role of a strategic coach, right? Like there's pretty much every single team has a head coach and a strategic coach, but Thomas Thinkard, our head coach, would always introduce us as like I'm 1A and Croissant is 1B, and so this is kind of me filling like that role and having it as part of like my title, but also just having I took care of the entire off season, took care of the transfer of Ignar to the team that he wanted to go to, the building and the philosophy behind how our coaching staff needed to adjust to the new needs of our players. Even though we had 4 returning players, it's like, what's the next step of their journey and their development, right? And bringing Huki on board, all that stuff. So that's stuff that I do, but like that just means that I'm working in the off season when a lot of coaches only work for 6 to 9 months of the year, depending on how far they go internationally. And so it just means I have like less of a break, which I enjoy because I'm just really passionate about pushing North American League of Legends forward, pushing our program at NRG forward. So yeah, I take care of a lot of like other management responsibilities too during the year, but they don't really interfere with like my love for the game and my love for just day-to-day working with the players and working with the other coaches. And so, yeah, I'm just really happy to have the opportunity.
How many coaches do you guys have this year?
So this year, I'd say we have 5 coaches, and we have Juves, who is assistant director, and he's doing a lot of management stuff. But he obviously still was with us as part of our coaching staff. But yeah, so I think, and it's funny because people are always unsure about the exact number, but like last year we also had 5, and we had 2 academy coaches, and then we had like Edward, who consults a lot of different teams at any given time. He was never like specifically one of our coaches, but we would call him a performance coach. And so when we were on stage, once we had 8 coaches, because once Academy got dissolved, we wanted to retain MASH and Juve still and make sure that they had the landing spot. And so at some point we had 7 coaches, right? So now we have like 6 staff overall, but if we're to look at most teams, whether it's LEC has more staff across the board, and obviously LCK, LPL has the most, but I'd say there's a lot of teams now that range between, like the lowest amount of staff would be like Shopify. They have Revan and like he has a team manager or something like that. But a lot of coaching staffs like FlyQuest, I think they have somewhere between like 6 to 9 staff overall, right? If you include their, if you don't include their GM, like -1, right? But they have analysts, all that stuff. I have worked a lot on our analytics platform, and we don't have like a dedicated analyst. So in that sense, we have 6 total staff, right? And so I think overall, like obviously everyone is making like everyone has to deal with the financial like turmoil. We have like, I think NRG's done a really good job of getting like Kia and like a lot of like being smart with our spending, but I'd say we're right in the middle of the pack in terms of like number of coaches or number of support staff, but I'd say we're definitely at the top end in terms of understanding actually how much is every single person doing and how they contribute, right? So we get the most out of our 6 staff for sure. Yeah.
So I want to switch gears here and talk about your love for Magic as well.
Yeah.
Did you just start getting into Magic a little?
So Travis was first trying to get me to play Magic in like the start of last year, so about like 12 months ago. But I like downloaded Arena, and I'd also talked to Ellis about it a few times, and he's like, Arena is actually really like fun, and it's like it's a very good way to learn the mechanics of the game. There's good tutorials and stuff. But I couldn't get fully into it, and it was also a pretty stressful spring split last year when we were still CLG. And so, but then in around like June, I went to one of my first like actual drafts, and there was a lot of like, just like esports like adjacent people and a lot of really helpful people that introduced me to the game. And so it was really interesting because I felt like playing Magic was helping me understand like the language and terminology that like Magic players have to describe like drafting or the actual like you envision yourself as how do you envision the win conditions of your like deck and your composition versus the enemies, and managing threats and all that stuff. That was stuff that I was able to incorporate into like I have a groundwork for how I understand League of Legends that I've developed. I never had like a mentor or like a coach that I really worked under, but I've been developing that over time. But a lot of it's like just improv, right? And so going back through that groundwork and then rewriting a lot of it through the lens of like a more precise like way of speaking about like game theory and that kind of stuff was really interesting. And it's also nice because I'm pretty much all League of Legends. Like I watch every single region. I rewatch a lot of our games in our scrims, and so it's nice to not feel like I get off the clock at like 7 or 8, and then I usually will watch League from like 10 to 2 a.m. and then go to sleep. But now like once a week, or I haven't played any Magic since this split started, but in like 6 days I'm planning to go to like a little thing. So that'll be for the new set and everything, and it's cool because it's just like every month or every 3 months there's like a big set.
So I know everyone's gonna think of LS when they think of Magic the Gathering, and I find it quite interesting because I think there are a lot of parallels that you can draw for like League of Legends and for Magic the Gathering itself, and like how you construct a deck of, for like the audience or whatnot, everyone knows like a counterspell deck, for instance, is it has a certain theme, and that's how they construct the deck specifically is through counterspells, and maybe it's good against a direct damage deck or something like that, or you have like a sliver deck or a goblin deck or whatnot. How has that helped you shape, I guess, your ideas about League of Legends and maybe like specifically drafting or team composition? I imagine it's very useful there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think actually the thing about, I still have so much that I need to learn about Magic because like when I get into something, when I got into Magic, I tried to climb as high as possible, but I don't have like a really strong fundamental understanding still of some things that and how to talk about the game. But I think the way that Magic was introduced to me related to League years ago when I was trying to understand like certain metaphors that LS or other creators would use, like the different colors, right, and the different themes that each of these colors has and kind of what they lean towards. But more so than thinking, because we don't have counter spells, we don't have like those archetypes to really think about. It's more about like the resource allocation and this pace and speed and flow of your deck, right? So when people talk about aggro or they talk about mid range, it's like you don't have a concept of like range and zones in Magic, because everything like well, in League you need to have a very visual understanding of like jungle contests, right, and which spaces and which brushes to take in the vision aspects of it. But what you can understand is like every League composition has a curve, right, and this curve concept is something that really like Magic's like how universally curves are talked about really helped me understand it. Is like you have turns, and you also have turns in League that are based off of tempo, and so yeah, tempo and curves and just how these things interact was something that I found really interesting at the start, and I still constantly, like when I see a new set and I see how the meta changes based off of the introduction of certain cards, then I'm able to also understand, well, how does a new card based off of a patch change in League of Legends, like how does that change the meta, and how does that change the like viability and the just the strength of different like early game compositions versus mid game picks. It's like Ivern, a lot of people think is like a really scaling champion because it's an enchanter, right? And obviously Ivern outscales champions like Sejuani, but if it can also match the curve of Sejuani in terms of its early game impact, like we saw this game, then that's really devastating because you're kind of outpacing the enemy at every single step. So that's why I don't know exactly the like the triangle theory of like, okay, well, mid range beats this, because I think it changes based set to set, but like if you're really late game, obviously aggro will just take over. You'll beat them in a few turns, right? But if you're mid range, you can survive the early game onslaught from aggro, and then you will just outscale them as well. But if you're mid range against aggro, or if you're mid range against full scaling, then or a control or something, then like at a certain point, your mid range deck will not be able to. You won't have killed them early enough, and then they will outscale you as well, right? So those concepts I think are really interesting. And that's the main. Those are some of my main lessons.
I could talk to you for hours about this, but we'll cut it short. Thank you very much. You bring in the burn deck with NRG, so I like it. Well, this has been Azento from Esports Heaven and Croissant from NRG. Thank you.
Thank you so much.